How would you answer these questions?
Yeah, I think if we break each of them down, so absolutely every single vehicle and trip is covered by insurance. Every single vehicle has its own insurance for the car, and then Uber has another policy insurance on top of that, an umbrella insurance. So there's multiple levels of insurance for every trip that's taken.
So if something does go wrong and someone's injured, there is insurance in place to cover them.
$5.6 million per trip here in Australia.
Right.
So absolutely. So there's multiple levels of insurance. I think when we talk about GST, so the rules around GST is that small businesses and subcontractors don't need to pay GST unless they're earning over $75,000 a year.
Yes.
And so this is, as I said before, a part-time thing for most drivers. They're making maybe $500 a week.
Okay, so it's actually up to each individual driver. So if they're only earning $1,000 a week gross out of Uber, then they don't need to charge GST.
Yeah.
So you don't sort of put all this together and make them charge GST.
So today that's the ruling that how small business or subcontractors work. I mean, any time, and we talked about the share economy before. Malcolm Turnbull talked about the share economy delivering great benefits to consumers, and part of the share economy is a new economic model that's coming into the cities that we live in, and that's having impacts on various different departments. And tax is one of them. And really what's happening today is the tax organisations and authorities need to look at these new models and consider the regimes that they have in place and adapt them to these new innovations.
So we're talking about the tax authorities here as opposed to the taxi industry as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is happening, the share economy is happening more than just across transportation. It's happening with houses, it's happening with retail, with anything.
Well, of course, I mean, you've got groups like Airbnb, for example, which is, you can, if you're not using your house one weekend and, you can find someone on the internet who wants to use it, you can make some money out of it.
Absolutely. This is a model that's changing industries across the board, and it's really about how do these new regimes, or these regimes, tax regimes, for example, cope with these sort of changes. And so we are actively engaged with various tax organisations, including the ATO, having conversations about how do we adapt and change. And if the rules change and we need to push GST out on an UberX platform, we'll do so. But at this stage, we're in conversations about how to manage these changes.
Now, let's talk big picture, talk about a vision for the future. The last state election, there wasn't a great deal to separate the two parties, but one thing they were different on was this issue of the East-West link. Do we build a big tunnel underneath Alexandra Parade and join up the Eastern Freeway with CityLink and ultimately with the Western Ring Road? And, the federal government says it will only fund projects if they're big nation-building road projects. You're at the forefront of changing the way people get from A to B. How do you see it? What's your vision?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it really, for us, people get caught up on this taxi versus Uber conversation. It is much bigger than that conversation. So how we're looking at it today, today we've got Uber Black and UberX. In 3 to 6 months, I'm hoping to have a product called Uber Pool. It is essentially sophisticated carpooling where you can have one car but two separate trips riding in the car at the one time.
I remember in America years ago there'd always be a lane of the freeway at peak hour where you had to have a minimum of 3 people. It varied from city to city, but I mean you had to have at least 3 people in the car, and I mean people would take mannequins and blow up humans and stuff like that to fool the police. But I mean the idea was that people should carpool.
Exactly, and as you get to this model of really sophisticated carpooling, what we're able to do is for the drivers, they're actually going to be in trip more often, which means they're making more money. As they're making more money, we can really start to balance the cost a consumer spends on a trip or push the prices down, making sure that a driver is still earning good income. And what happens then when you start to push the price of this safe, reliable transportation down so low, it actually becomes smarter and more economical not to own a vehicle.
So you're saying that the average person might say, look, I don't need to have a car parked in the garage all day. I can just rely upon Uber to do my driving for me.
Yes, and often a good point that you make, that the car, you purchase a car, it sits in the garage 70% of the time while the asset depreciates. So what we're saying is the price of this transportation becomes so affordable. People sell their cars. When people start selling their cars, it actually takes cars off the road, and the cars that remain on the road actually have more people in them. So you've got 3, 4, 5 people in a car at any one time. And as you start to think through that in a couple of years, of people, less cars on the road, better utilising the cars we've got, we actually are reducing congestion and traffic. And funnily enough, I got caught in traffic today and I had to run here to make it on time. But as we actually start to take cars off the road, we reduce congestion. And what we're doing is actually creating cities better to live in. It's easier to get around.
It's a fascinating vision. Going back to the pooling concept, though. So let's say I live in Doncaster, and I don't feel I can't afford a single Uber fare to get me to work. But what you're saying is you can find other people that live around that area or on the route to my work. And I might be picked up in the morning by an Uber car, and we drive a couple of kilometres, then we pick up someone else, and then we pick up someone else. Then the three of us essentially split the fare.
Correct, yeah.
And so there's one car on the road, not three.
Yeah, and so we use very smart technology and algorithms to manage how far of a detour you make, because we don't want to make it inconvenient. So the technology manages that, but it's essentially that one person jumps in. If there's another person on the way happy to share a ride, then they'll jump in. You could get a third person. As the first gets out, a fourth person gets in. So you're actually just sharing the ride and using that one vehicle and reducing the cost as you do that per rider.
A friend of mine, Steve Pizzardi, who often broadcasts here on 3AW, he's a car expert, he's a former presenter of Top Gear here in Australia. He reckons that in the future, driving a car will be something that only enthusiasts do. You know, that if you love old cars or you have a fascination for motorsport, you will drive. But for most people for whom driving is just a chore, that services like Uber will effectively take over. You will no longer need to have a license yourself. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I've spent a lot of time living overseas, in London in particular, in very dense cities, large cities. This is already real. Most people that live in those cities don't rely on cars, and I can see this. We're seeing it every day in Australia. I know I talk to a lot of people about Uber and a lot of friends and business contacts I meet, and they're starting to sell their car. You know, if you've got a nice car, it might cost you X amount of dollars per month just for the lease. That takes you a long way in Uber today, but imagine with Uber Pool how far that gets you.
Well, I mean, I'm an example. I mean, my wife and I worked out, we probably drive our car, I would say, 8,000 or 9,000 k's a year. The reality is, it just sits there either in the street or in the garage depreciating, and if we could have a reliable service and one with a child seat fitted, which has its own complications. But I mean, frankly, I do not enjoy driving around town. I find it a complete chore. Yeah, it's horrible. I don't mind going for a drive on the weekend. So, again, is this the sort of travelling that Uber could take care of down the track?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Getting around the city, it's easy. You push a button, you wait 3.5 minutes here in Melbourne, the car turns up. You can actually do something while you're on your journey. You jump out at your destination and off you go. It's the same when you come home. And you know, people often say, well, what happens if you need to go away for the country? There's car rental businesses. There's also similar peer-to-peer or peer-to-peer companies that the guy next door will rent you his car for an hour or a day. So, yeah, it's becoming a very viable, even in Australia, Melbourne and the cities here, to live in that sort of environment where you don't rely on a car.
Finally, I've had many emails and many phone calls from representatives of the taxi industry over the past few weeks, and it is clear to me they see Uber as an unregulated threat to their livelihood. How would you answer that?
I mean, we hear those calls from the taxi associations, the taxi industry as well, and I think, I mean, I listen to a lot of those things, and a lot of it is scaremongering, a lot of it is threats, and a lot of it is just downright lies, to be honest. And we hear that, but the thing that we can do is remain focused on what we do best, and that is to continue to provide the safest, most reliable and cost-effective transportation we can here. So that's what we'll continue to do. Our goal is to continue to drive the best prices and the best working conditions for the partner drivers, and that's what we'll continue to do.
We'll leave it there. Simon Rossi, General Manager of Uber here in Melbourne. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Tom.
Right, we'll have finance with Scott Hayward in a few minutes. Your calls as well, your reaction, 96900 693 13 13 32. Right now, they're at 4:30, the headlines with